I Am Setsuna.
There we go.
It's a fairly small RPG in both in terms of like scope, and I think even the team that made it was relatively small, especially compared to sort of like large scale RPGs you see out there these days. But this week it's sort of one of the major releases. So
if you don't count Pokemon Go,
yeah,
people are all abuzz for I Am Setsuna. So this is from Tokyo RPG Factory,
right? And Tokyo RPG Factory is sort of a subset or like a small studio within Square-Enix, and I believe if I'm remembering my anecdotes correctly, is that like when they were hiring for this studio, they did not mention that it was a part of Square-Enix. Like they wanted to make sure that the people that they were bringing in were people who were sort of like who were passionate about the project of like making an RPG that harkens back to the old like mid 90s or like 90s era games like Final Fantasy and Chrono Trigger.
Mm-hmm.
But they, even if they cited those games, they didn't specifically say like this is a Square-Enix company,
right?
Because I assume that there would be people who just sort of would like want to get a foot in the door at Square-Enix otherwise. So.
Well, that's the bizarre part too, because I started this game last night and played maybe like an hour and a half of it or so. And during the opening credits, which I want to talk to you about in a bit, it was like, man, who are these people? Are these like old Square employees? Because there's such enthusiasm that we found when we visited for like these old Super Nintendo RPGs.
Yeah.
But I don't think anybody... There are no big names from that era that are working on this game. It's not like, hey, the director of Chrono Trigger came back and he's making a new one. It's just kind of the next generation of fans that happen to work within Square now are making that throwback.
Right. And I definitely don't want to... This is not to diminish the contributions of any of the people in those credits either, but I don't think that you will... Yeah, you won't see any of those like big names that you would recognize from, back in the day. I think the people making this game are the people who were playing Chrono Trigger in the 90s and enjoying it.
Yeah. And I read some interviews last night with the creators, and I guess like it all started because the director was seeing a lot of games and people in the West kind of making these JRPG throwbacks. And he said that he saw Child of Light coming from Ubisoft.
Yeah.
He's like, he said, I don't know if a Western game developer can handle this genre. Like, we should tackle it again. And it's awesome. It's the concept of Square going back and making a Chrono Trigger Super Nintendo RPG inspired downloadable game is really great.
Yeah.
And then beyond that, Joe, how does it fare?
Well, okay. I want to come back and talk about that after we're done. So remind me to talk about sort of Square's goal with resurrecting this style of game. But ultimately, this I Am Setsuna is very close. Like if you played Chrono Trigger, it is very close to that. In some ways, less so in others. But I guess the warning I have to give is for people like me, and I know people like Dan who were into those games in that era as they were coming out, was that like you can kind of fall into a trap of being like, well, if it's more Chrono Trigger, I'm in. I don't care how close it is, I am right there. I'm in.
Totally.
And I would caution you with that because a lot of what makes you remember Chrono Trigger fondly is things that it did that were really novel at the time. And it turns out that a game that sort of tries to copy some of those ideas, even though they still are fun to play, it's still a fun game to play, it does not have the same charm in terms of giving you something unexpected, right? So ultimately, and there are other things, the other things about it that make it not like Chrono Trigger also sort of bring it down. I hate to keep using the Chrono Trigger callback,
but it's the most applicable here.
It is very apt, and in leading up to this game's release is the one that like was sort of harped on the most. Like the Chrono Trigger was used to set people's expectations for this game. So I feel like in some ways talking about it in those terms is important. But
yeah, so you talk about like having novel experiences with Chrono Trigger. Like I didn't play Chrono Trigger until maybe 5-6 years maybe after it came out. So it's not like it was that fresh and new, but I still think the power of those characters and that world pulled me into the point that I absolutely fell in love with it.
Right. And this for me in particular is where the problem comes in, is that I think I Am Setsuna in some ways is a misunderstanding about what people liked about Chrono Trigger and maybe a constraint of budget of what they were actually able to produce.
Yeah.
So I Am Setsuna has, in a lot of ways, has things like the combat system
Mm-hmm.
is 3 party members, turn based, like the old ATB system. You can team up with like 2 party members can join in for a joint attack. 3 party members later on join in for like a big attack.
It has a move called X Strike for level.
It has X Strike. It has Luminaire. It
Uh-huh.
has. I'm not going to spoil all of them, but like a lot of callbacks in name. In fact, one of the characters whose name is Eterna, like you get her really early on, has like wears like a green hood with little like froggy eyes on top of it. Like this isn't a coincidence.
my gosh.
She's clearly designed to make
Uh-huh.
you say that looks like a frog.
Yeah.
And those kind of nods are like fun for fans, but they also don't like recreate Chrono Trigger, right? They're just nods to it. And for me, what the problem becomes is when you stray out of the combat system, which is pretty much just straight up more Chrono Trigger.
Mm-hmm.
You are in a world that is very similar. Scratch that. Does not have a lot of variety to it.
It's all snow and trees.
It's snowed. Your dungeons are, you go from snowy cave to snowy mountain to snowy field to back to snowy cave.
Mm-hmm.
There are some ancient ruins in there a little bit.
Ooh.
But like it's a lot of samey stuff in terms of the environments, the towns, the dungeons that you're going to, which is a problem when you compare again to Chrono Trigger, where it's like you're going to prehistoric jungles and you're going to futuristic wastelands and like magical cities in the sky, and this doesn't have any of that sort of like, wow, I'm someplace new.
Why is that? Do you think it's just constraints on the art team's assets? Why is it all snow?
I think that was their central theme, actually. Like, I remember reading up a bit about it, and I played it at E3 for a little bit.
Okay.
And the snowy thing was supposed to be kind of like parallel to the whole theme of sadness. Like, they're supposed to be kind of intertwined in a way. Do I think it works? I'm not sure, because also what I was wondering when I was playing was, is this going to be like the setting, is it going to all look the same? Like, that's kind of what I felt when I was playing Steep, too, is just, like, snow everywhere. And, like, is it going to change?
When am I going to sticky on rocks?
Yeah.
Watch that
You
joke.
know, snow looks bland, unless you do something, I don't know, something different with it, like caves and stuff.
And it's not a total, like the thing that Elise brought up is important in that, like, there is a kind of thematic consistency that comes across that is interesting.
Mhm.
I mean, when everything is snowy and buried in ice, it really, like, it does convey a sense of like desolation about the world. The I really like the soundtrack, very like piano heavy
Yeah, I like
soundtrack. Again, like with the visuals, with the sort of story theme, is like really cements that idea of theirs in. The problem is I don't know if like that intent and the effect of it, I don't know that it outweighs the general tedium of just like going to the same places all the time and not really getting that sense of like the situation being refreshed at all,
Yeah, for sure.
So there's that element of it also, and this is a totally subjective element of it, but like the story just didn't do it for me.
Even starting out in the very beginning, where it's like, all right, you need to go kill this little girl, and it almost has a little Ned Stark Game of Thronesy type thing, where it's like, okay, all right, I understand that analogy, and then quickly it becomes, as far as I can tell, Final Fantasy X, where this woman has to sacrifice herself, and it's part of this age-old tradition. It just seems like very much greatest hits.
Yeah, and there's a sense of, and there are points in which the story diverges in sort of interesting, even though it's sort of minor ways. But yeah, generally the core premise of this game is like, there is a woman named Setsuna who needs to go sacrifice herself to buy the world like a respite from these monster attacks.
Because these monsters are getting worse and worse around this village, guys.
And the whole party that goes along are sort of, like bound by this kind of sacred oath to protect the sacrifice.
Yeah.
Which is Final Fantasy X's plot.
It's exactly that.
And
even the writing itself. Like, by the way, I enjoyed my time with this game. Like, I hope I stick with it, so I don't want to seem overly negative. But the writing was just, it felt a little bit bland out of the gate. Do the characters get some more depth? Is it clever at any point?
So I mean, there are parts in the story that are interesting, but overall, I think where the big problem for me is that like I did not feel like the characters really got their interesting like spotlight moments.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's like you get this one little guy in your party named Kerr. He's like a heavy magic user, and after the little sequence where you sort of like find out what's going on with him and his little like hometown, he follows you around for a little while. But so like some of that stuff is centered on who he is as a character. Then once he joins your party, there's like he may as well just not be there. He chimes in dialogue sometimes, but you know like the story never veers back toward him in a way that like fleshes him out as a character. And I feel like it's like that for pretty much everyone, is they have their sort of big introductory moments.
Mm-hmm.
And then you don't get that sort of recurring sense of them being a central, like a part of the world, or that their actions are important.
I feel like we had that complaint a little bit about Final Fantasy VII with our game club towards the back half of that, where it's like, I wish they kept these character stories going a little bit more.
Yeah, and so for me, that was part of the complaint, and also just the fact that like having played Final Fantasy X a couple times, it's like you can pretty much see every bump in the road that's coming, with a few sort of like, what's this person's exact backstory or motivation? You know?
Yeah.
If you've played Final Fantasy X and Chrono Trigger, you've really got a solid foundation of figuring out what's going on here.
But for a fun game to sit in the air conditioning in the summer and play, like, if you want to have that throwback experience, I think it's going to be satisfying for a lot of fans out there, don't you?
I think so. I mean, I think that's what they were trying in the first place, is to like replicate that era.
But
so
you can
badly,
do that,
but yeah, I don't know. I think people will like it though.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I enjoyed my time with it, you know, but hearing that the characters don't get fleshed out that much and that kind of stays the same in terms of the setting and stuff is a little disappointing, but like, I know I am still going to play it.
Yeah, it's so exciting for this team to get this shot and to have a decent budget. Like, you know, the art isn't fantastic and it feels a little bit cheaper around the edges. It's made in Unity and whatnot. Not that that's a terrible engine, but I wish that they were just hell-bent on an original story and like some real heart to these characters.
Yeah. I do want to get around to that. But another thing, like, you know, asking about like whether people will enjoy it.
Yeah.
As someone who comes from a background of like playing a lot of these kinds of games, I did have a good time with it. You know, so it's like despite my complaints with it, there's something that is just fun about slipping into a very familiar sort of set of systems and story, and the fact that this is a genre. I mean, JRPGs in general are thinner. You know, that field is thinner than it used to be. But to have one that so specifically is emulating an era that I love, even if it's familiar, it's still fun.
Yeah.
So you know, if you fall into that camp, as long as you are aware of the sort of potential pitfalls along the way, I think you can really still have some fun with it.
And I'm trying to think, did you play any of the Bravely Default games?
I tried to.
Okay.
Basically the whole element of repetition in those, like killed it for me.
I'm trying to wonder how much overlap there is, where it's like this seems maybe a little more satisfying narratively than the Bravely Default games.
Yeah.
Dantac, I'm leaning towards you because I know you played them.
I have. The narratives in those games are not compelling. However, I did find the systems compelling.
Okay. So basically the inverse of Setsuna then, is that what we're getting at?
I haven't played any Setsuna, and I'm not sure I'm going to after, you know.
Really?
The rest. I don't want anything that could hurt my memories of Chrono Trigger and those other great
Well, look, it's not like the new
They're not gonna do
Ghostbusters.
that.
Yeah, it's not destroying your childhood.
Right.
It's just not doing anything novel.
Frankly, you know, I got stuff to play. I don't want to waste my time with it, you know.
But you love that era so much.
do.
Wouldn't you
I
feel
do.
like you're sliding into a warm jacuzzi, as Joe eloquently put it?
I'll give
Yeah,
it an hour, and I'll see how I feel.
Okay.
That's fair.
But one of the things that I wanted to bring up, and this is circling around to what I wanted to say at the beginning, was that like what has me nervous is that like this is a decent first attempt at sort of recapturing this era, right? And there are some problems with it, like I said about like the environmental design, the fact that so like all the dungeons are basically just like, here's a little path and here's an area with enemies, and here's a little path and an area with enemies. You don't have the sort of like interesting cathedral that you're walking around in Chrono Trigger, or, you know, so it's like very straightforward, kind of dull dungeon design too. But my worry is that Square-Enix is going to look at the sort of like middle of the road reception that this game is getting and be like, well, people say they want it, but they don't. So we're not going to try anymore. And I think that response being based on the sort of misconstrued idea that they are producing exactly what people want and people just aren't taking it, rather than it's like, no, I mean, what we want and what we liked in Chrono Trigger were like the characters, the story, the scenario, like it's this whole combination of things that we're sort of getting half of.
Right.
But what I'm worried about is that this is going to be seen as a failure and that they're not going to try anymore, when really just a little more time, like more fleshing it out a little bit more, like bridging those gaps in the environment, in the story, in the characters, which I know is easier said than done. But I mean, like they are more than halfway to creating something that really can recapture that.
But not that this might be controversial, but not that everybody is the same at Square. But when was the last time you think a Square game, Japanese Square game, nailed characters and nailed story? I would argue that I have not seen it for a while. And I'm not saying they're incapable of pulling it off, but for me personally, I haven't
like a
felt
JRPG, one of their JRPGs in particular.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think it's been a while, and so I just wonder how well it can hit it. Dan Tack, what are you doing?
I'm just wondering when that time is.
Okay.
I think I have to go pretty far back.
See, it's tough. It's like, hey, studio, make charming characters. It's like they're cranking out so many games. And you mentioned this is a throwback, but you got to remember, I mean, there's like Final Fantasy Dimensions. Like they've been experimenting with these throwbacks for a while, so it's not like it's coming completely out of the blue.
Right. The key word there is experimenting. Like, come on, these like Dimensions and like the other things, like just making the games actually worse, like look worse while they port them over to other platforms. And yeah, no, I don't. That's just saying, hey, there's a game everybody likes. Let's just throw it on this thing.
Yeah. Here's a thought experiment, Joe.
Okay.
If you played this game, forget review scores, forget all that stuff, right?
Okay.
You're just playing this game as a fan. If I went up to you right when you hit the start button and I whispered in your ear, this was made by a Western developer, and then there's no other difference in the quality of the game, versus I said, this came from Square in Tokyo, does it add a certain panache? Is there a certain like enthusiasm knowing that it came from Japan? This is what I kept thinking about when I was playing last night. Even if the game is identical, is there something that's intrinsically cooler about it coming from Tokyo? Am I nuts?
Yes.
Yeah,
you don't feel that at all?
I don't get that.
If I said like, hey, these are 4 guys in Seattle that made this game, you would feel the exact same way about it?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know, just my thought experiment. Apparently it hit a dead end.
If nothing else, I might be a little more impressed if it were put together by like a 1 or 2 person team.
Okay.
You know?
Sure. Stardew Valley style, I get it.
Okay, yeah.
But I appreciate you not giving a pass to pure nostalgia, Joe.
Well, thank you. I mean, but I wish that I wish it would have been more than that, you know?
What'd you end up giving this?
I gave it a 7.5.
What an accurate score.